Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're stepping right into the realm of systematic theology and unapologetic, data-driven analysis. We are laying down an absolutely uncompromising framework for theological study. So often, critics of the biblical narrative will just lob attacks based on external traditions, emotional appeals, or completely isolated texts. Well, today, we are setting a baseline. If an external source is used to attack the biblical text, that source has to be subjected to the exact same rigorous standard of historical, mathematical, and cultural consistency. No double standards, no free passes. Here is our docket for today. We're going to systematically tackle 4 distinct battlegrounds. First, the math of Rebekah's true age. Second, the history of the Quranic Samaritan. Third, the tradition of the night journey. And fourth, the cultural reality of ancient Near Eastern marriage customs. Think of us as operating a systematic courtroom today. Our guiding principle is what we call the Apologist Standard. This simply means that if polemicists want to attack the text, their own claims must survive this exact same standard of evidence. We aren't interested in lazy arguments that just shatter under the weight of basic scrutiny. We are interested in whether a narrative perfectly aligns with the documented realities of history, math, and culture. Let's start with argument 1. The mathematical inconsistency of the 3-year-old Rebekah polemic. You've probably heard this one before. It's a polemic specifically designed to shock the modern conscience and discredit the biblical patriarchs. Islamic polemicists, among others, will frequently cite a late rabbinic commentator named Rashi to claim that Rebekah was merely a 3-year-old toddler when she married Isaac. Now, that sounds horrifying, right? But the real question we have to ask is, does this claim survive basic, elementary mathematical scrutiny? And does it even align with the very tradition these critics are trying to pull from? Let's actually just do the math, step by step, using their own chosen tradition mixed with the explicit biblical text. The logic here is absolutely impossible to refute. Okay, step 1. Tradition records that Rebekah's total lifespan was 133 years, and she died when her son Jacob was 99. Step 2. Simple subtraction. 133 minus 99 means Rebekah was exactly 34 years old when she gave birth to Jacob and Esau. Step 3. Genesis explicitly tells us that Isaac was 40 years old when he married Rebekah, and 60 when the twins were born. So they were married for exactly 20 years prior to having children. Step 4. We just take her age at motherhood, which is 34, and subtract those 20 years of marriage. Boom. 14, the math works out perfectly to prove she was a 14-year-old young woman, not a toddler. The whole 3-year-old Rebekah polemic completely collapses under its own weight when you just take a second to do the math. You simply cannot cherry-pick a late rabbinic commentary to attack the Bible while completely ignoring the mathematical impossibility it creates within the very timeline of the text. Moving on to argument 2, the historical impossibility of the Quranic Samaritan. So the Quran makes a really specific claim in Surah 20. It states that while Moses was away on Mount Sinai receiving the law, a Samaritan, referred to as a Samiri, misled the Israelites, getting them to forge and worship the golden calf. It's a foundational story for them, but history tells a drastically different story about who was actually present in the desert during that era. When you look at the historical timeline, the impossibility just jumps right out at you. The exodus of the Israelites from Egypt happened roughly between 1400 and 1200 BCE. But here's the catch. The Samaritans, as a distinct recognized people group and geographic identity, literally did not exist until the Assyrian conquest of the northern kingdom in 722 BCE. As the historian Josephus meticulously records, the Assyrians transplanted foreign nations from Cutha into the region of Samaria. Those people became known as the Cuthians, or the Samaritans. So the absolutely crucial point here is that this is a severe historical inaccuracy. You cannot have a Samaritan leading a rebellion at Mount Sinai because the Samaritan identity wouldn't even be born for another 600 to 800 years. It is a blatant historical anachronism. It's retroactively placing a much later geographic identity into an ancient text. When you apply the Apologist Standard, the narrative just shatters against historical reality. Let's hit argument 3, the theological dilemma of the night journey. Okay, let's look at the famous narrative of the Isra and Miraj, the night journey found in Surah 17. The claim is that Muhammad was transported to the farthest mosque, which is widely identified as Al-Aqsa in Jerusalem. Now, Orthodox Islam demands that this was a literal physical journey. But again, we have to hold this to the Apologist Standard. Does the timeline of historical architecture actually support a physical flight to a physical building? We are looking at a massive theological dilemma here.
a double-edged sword. On one hand, we have a pure historical impossibility. The physical Al-Aqsa Mosque structures were not built until between 685 and 691 CE. Muhammad died in 632 CE. He could not have physically visited a physical building that did not exist yet. It's that simple. But on the other hand, if defenders try to pivot and claim it wasn't a physical building but rather just a spiritual vision, well, they run headfirst into a contradiction against their own orthodox literalism.
And this dilemma is beautifully illustrated by the words of his own wife Aisha, recorded in the earliest biography of Muhammad by Ibn Ishaq. She states plainly regarding the night journey, his body never left his bed. We're using one of the absolute earliest Islamic historical sources to prove that the literal physical claim contradicts their own foundational data. So pick your poison. Either it's a historical anachronism of visiting a non-existent mosque, or it's a spiritual vision that completely contradicts orthodox traditional customs. Consistency demands a choice. Finally, argument 4, ancient Near Eastern marriage customs as the cultural standard. When critics attack the Bible's historical accounts of marriage, they almost always do so using modern, 21st century Western sensibilities. But true, honest historical study requires us to systematically document the standard marriage customs of the ancient world. We have to look at the actual sociological data of the era rather than just relying on emotional appeals. And when we look at the ancient Near East, thousands of years ago, a very, very clear picture emerges. Just look at the customary ages. During Abraham's era in the Middle East, the customary age of betrothal and marriage for young women was between 12 and 14 years old. That was when they were considered young adults. In surrounding empires like Babylon and Persia, the age was typically 15 to 18. So, Rebekah being 14, it perfectly aligns with the mathematical proof we walked through earlier, and it lands right in the undisputed historical pocket of that specific culture. So what is the takeaway here? Unlike the glaring historical anachronisms we found in the external polemics, like Samaritans existing centuries before they were formed, or physical mosques existing decades before they were ever built, the biblical narrative is flawlessly consistent. It matches the documented historical, cultural, and mathematical norms of its time. It requires absolutely no mental gymnastics, no ignoring of historical timelines, and no suspension of basic arithmetic. And that brings us to our verdict. Consistent apologetics. We have successfully exposed how external attacks completely shatter when forced to endure the same rigorous analytical standard they try to apply to the Bible. The Apologist Standard is a game changer. When you hold competing claims to the fire of objective history and hard math, the truth always rises to the top. The biblical narrative proves to be cohesive and internally consistent, while the lazy polemics we examine today just rely heavily on anachronism and logical contradiction. So, I have to ask you, will you demand this rigorous standard of evidence the next time a critic attacks the biblical narrative? Don't let lazy logic slide. Equip yourselves with these facts, hold the line, and demand absolute consistency. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep learning, keep questioning, and I'll catch you next time.